morning. We have three lectures this morning, three very interesting scholars. The first one is Ronald Suny. It's very difficult, or no, it's very simple to say that Ronald is maybe with Richard Ovanessian the best and first serious scholar generation in America. I remember that Ronald is the first student of Nina Garsoyan, yes, in Columbia. Yeah. Okay. No, Ronald teaching, it's a professor of history at University of Michigan. It's a return after some time in political science, yes. Okay, and he's author of more and more book. I remember the first one that I see about Baku. It's a very interesting work. And after about the Georgian, and the last one around the question of genocide, and it's the last, it's a Slavic association.
It won the prize.
A prize,
Best book
yes.
Of the year, yeah.
In this year?
Yeah.
Okay, okay. You have 20 minutes.
Oh, good. What can you say in 20 minutes? Thank you so much, Raymond, for those nice words, and thank you all for coming. I remember, I often say this line, but I'm going to say it again. I remember when I was first introduced at a meeting. I was just a graduate student at the time, and I was introduced by the local intellectual in Philadelphia at the time, a dentist, and he said, well, this young man is going to talk today. I don't know what about, but I hope he don't talk too long. So I will try not to be too long. Now, few scholars have investigated the relations of Tsarist Russia and the Armenians of Van before and during the events of 1915. But as we heard in that excellent talk by Hrant Dink, this is key to understanding the genocide. As is well known, in April 1915, fearing that violence that was already occurring in the surrounding areas would soon spread to Van, Armenians in the city organized to defend themselves, and they secured part of that town. For the Ottoman and later Turkish Republic government, and some pseudo-historians afterwards, the efforts of the Armenians were seen as insurrection or uprising, a threat to the integrity of the empire, and that interpretation has been used as a justification, both at the time and later, for the deportation and massacres of the Armenians, that is, the genocide. For Armenian writers and most historians, the Van events were a defensive effort in the face of approaching massacres and were seen as the prelude to what has become known to most scholars as the Armenian genocide. We all know that this literature, this historiography on these events has been marred by polemics, by partisan distortion of the events, by nationalist reinterpretations, etc. What I'm going to try to do very briefly today is place this story in the larger context of Russo-Ottoman relations, the great tragedy of the First World War, as well as the history of the Van Armenians and the Ottoman deportations and massacres. So I'm trying, as Hrant also tried, to create a dispassionate understanding of why a population that had declared its loyalty to the Ottoman state, whose leaders had helped mobilize thousands of young Armenian men to join the Ottoman army in the months before April 1915, turned suddenly to resistance against their own government. First, the Great War. This was a catastrophe for all the peoples of the Ottoman Empire, and most completely for Armenians and Assyrians. Of the more than 20 million subjects of the Sultan, perhaps as many as 5 million would perish as a consequence of the Young Turk decision to join what was for them not a war of necessity, but a war of choice. One has to remember that most of the victims in the Great War were civilians. 18% of Ottoman Muslims would die in Anatolia. The casualties of battle, famine, disease, and governmental disorganization. About 90% of Armenians would be gone by the end of the war, deported, massacred, forcibly converted to Islam. Note that the genocide had 3 prongs: mass killing, dispersion, and assimilation, forced assimilation, Islamization. Or they would be exiled beyond the borders of the new Turkey. The Young Turks had entered the war to save, even enhance their empire, only to preside over its demise. The war, of course, laid the foundations for the empire's successor, the national state created by the Turkish national movement, by ethnically cleansing what had now become the heartland of the Turks and mobilizing millions of ordinary Muslims to fight for their vatan, their fatherland. In Turkey's collective memory today, writes a very fine historian of the Ottoman War, Mustafa Aksakal, the Ottomans lost the First World War, the Turks won it. As Istanbul geared for war in the summer of 1914, the Ottomans looked everywhere for allies. They were actually divided as to what side to join. Should they join the Triple Alliance or the Entente? On the eve of the war, the Young Turks fished in the troubled waters of international diplomacy to see if the Entente powers, even Russia and Britain, would be interested in an alliance. But no convincing offers came from Britain or Russia, who were dedicated to enforcing the reform of the Ottoman provinces in Anatolia. Members of the government engaged in individual diplomatic forays. Enver negotiated with Romania, and Talat even made a trip to Crimea to see Tsar Nicholas II and Foreign Minister Sazonov. Both Enver and Talat lied to their counterparts about what proposals had been made to them by the other powers, this is called diplomacy, and what agreements they had signed. Ultimately, Germany appeared most attractive to many in high positions in Istanbul because it had not been involved in the piecemeal picking away of Ottoman territories as Britain, France, Italy, Russia, and Austro-Hungary had been. And so on August 2nd, 1914, a secret treaty was signed. Publicly, Istanbul announced its policy of armed neutrality, but the Russians quickly learned that the Ottomans and the Germans had agreed to fight together. However, even after signing this alliance with the Germans, for the next several weeks in August, the leading Young Turks continued to flirt with allying with Russia. Russia's ambassador to Istanbul, Mikhail Girs, and the Russian military attaché in Istanbul, Major General Maxim Leontiev, strongly favored such an alliance. And they felt, we can keep the Ottomans neutral until the point, I'm quoting now, in time when circumstances permit our own firm entrance into the straits, unquote. And he wrote to Foreign Minister Sazonov, quote, the historic moment has finally arrived in which we have the opportunity to make the Ottoman Empire submit to us. Enver even told General Leontiev that if the Russians accepted the Ottoman proposal to ally, remember this is after they had signed the treaty with Germany, Enver would tell the German officers in the empire, and I'm quoting now, without a minute's hesitation, now you are our enemies, and I ask you to leave, unquote. And he explained to the Russians, I have only Ottoman interests in mind. What they wanted from the Russians was guarantees of their territorial integrity and no support for what they called the efforts of Armenian nationalists in Anatolia. But Foreign Minister Sazonov was hesitant to make the necessary concessions, insisted that the Armenian reform project remain. It had already been agreed to by the great powers, and so eventually Enver and Talat joined with the Germans. And Talat would tell the American ambassador Henry Morgenthau in October, quote, "Russia is our greatest enemy, and we're afraid of her. If now, while Germany is attacking Russia, we give Russia a good kick and so make her powerless to injure us for some time, it is our duty for Turkey to administer that kick." Now, I've emphasized these complex events in the late summer and early fall of 1914 because I think they are key to understanding why a genocide occurred. The Turks decided to join the Germans. The Germans would not complain about what the Turks were doing in eastern Anatolia to the Armenians and others. In other words, the fate of millions of Ottoman citizens and others hung on these diplomatic notes passed between envoys and their superiors. I would argue that had Ottoman and Russian decisions been different, had the Ottomans and their allies been able to proceed with the agreed upon reforms in Anatolia, which were seen as by the great powers as an alternative to partition of the empire, to keep the empire together, but reformed to recognize Armenian problems. In all likelihood, had this occurred, there would have been no Armenian genocide. Decisions and timing were all. As one historian of the genocide has written, if the war, for instance, had started 1 or 2 years later, allowing enough time for partial implementation of the reform plan with its proportional representation of Christians in the gendarme force and so forth, it is very possible that the persecution, forced deportation, and extermination of the Ottoman Empire's Armenians would not have been viewed as an easy option, at least in that area, unquote. That historian was someone named Yaktan Yılmaz. In other words, I'm arguing that as overdetermined as the Armenian genocide appears in retrospect, there was nothing inevitable about the decisions and the consequences. These were choices made by the Young Turk government to destroy once and for all the Armenians of the empire, to end the Armenian question. Now, Yaktan very importantly mentioned that Armenians were also agents in this historical moment, and that's extraordinarily important. But one has to mention that there was a imbalance in agency. That is, the Turks, the government, the Ottomans, had all kinds of possibilities to act, and the Armenians had largely only very limited possibilities to react. These policies meant that the Armenians were, as I put it in the book, in a kind of dilemma of the damned. No matter what they did, they would probably end up victims. And what did they do? And this is important, and it seems to me this is something we have to emphasize in the new historiography leading up to the genocide. Most Armenians in the Ottoman Empire were loyal to the Ottoman Empire. They were Ottomans. This was their country. But they lived in a country that progressively was making it more and more difficult for them to be loyal to that empire. Right? And as Yaktan also mentioned, cooperation between the leading Armenian political party, the Hığutyun, and in Van particularly, continued right into the eve of World War I. But the Young Turks were moving in a different direction. They were developing plans based on a long-term affective disposition and emotional understanding that the Armenians were traitors, that they were subversive, that they were not to be trusted, that in fact they were allies of the Russians and the Entente in general, that they had to be deported and eventually eliminated. This growing consensus among Turks that Armenians were disloyal, in fact, was dissented to by some important Turkish officials. The Vali in Van, Tahsin Bey, informed his government, I'm quoting, "Neither before the general mobilization nor after has there been a single person from the Ottoman population who has immigrated to Russia or Iran or fled their home. Among the local Armenians, there was neither thoughts of revolt nor even opposition to the government. On the contrary, among the Dashnags, one can see an attitude of vocal support for and assistance vis-à-vis the government in regard to the general mobilization of the war. But the violence that then began to occur in the fall of 1914, particularly on the Caucasian and in Persia, where the first real killings took place, and this is very beautifully shown in David Gaunt's work about the Assyrians. The Assyrians are the first victims, and Armenians in Persia as well. That is, things were going on even before war had been officially declared between Russia and the Ottomans. It's in this particular context that one must see the attitudes of the Armenians of Van in early 1915 that led to what we can call the self-defense or the Van uprising. In my own view, and in the book I wrote called They Can Live in the Desert But Nowhere Else, I tried to argue that the key moment for the change from a disposition, from a thinking about dealing with the Armenians to actual activity is the colossal defeat of Enver's army at Sarıkamış. This is a key event. And Enver himself, after that, we have some evidence of this, after that event, thought he was in deep trouble. And yet the discourse, the understanding, the meaning given to the defeat was not of Turkish or Ottoman failure, but of Armenian treachery. And it's after that that thousands and thousands of Armenian soldiers were demobilized, turned into amele tabulare, work battalions, and eventually murdered. That is, so the muscle of the Armenian community was removed first, before indeed men and women were either killed or driven out of their homes in Erzurum and other places. So what about Van more specifically? Here Yektan has shown, I think in quite good detail, exactly the series of events that determined or overdetermined that the Armenians in Van would indeed revolt. That is, violence was already occurring. Massacres and killing were already in the environment of Van before the Armenians made this decision. And key events, indeed, were the murder of Ishkhan, the leader of the Dashnag armed forces, the arrest and later murder of Vramyan, who was indeed a deputy to the Ottoman parliament. In the months leading up to the war, the local Armenian nationalists, the Dashnags, as was mentioned, were closely allied with the leading the Vali, Tahsin Bey, of the city. And again, here's what the American missionary, Clarence Usher, testified about Vramyan and the Dashnags. The Dashnags did, and I'm quoting now, did all in their power to keep the peace throughout these months when the political situation was exceedingly complicated and the tension extreme. They knew themselves to be living in a powder magazine where the smallest spark would cause an all-destructive explosion. An act of the most justifiable self-defense might prove to be such a spark. So they told the Armenians to submit to anything rather than to antagonize the government, to submit to the burning of 2 or 3 villages, the murder of a dozen men without attempts at retaliation, which would give the Turks some excuse for general massacre. Well, eventually, with the coming to Van of Cevdet Bey, who was, of course, Enver's brother-in-law, and had been recently involved in the massacres of Armenians and Assyrians in Persia, that spark occurred. And the Armenians then organized for self-defense. They were rescued by the Russians after a long struggle, and they saved part of their population, though the Armenians around Van were, of course, sacrificed. Once the Armenians took control of the city, they did not prove to be, let's say, saints, of course. The Aram's government excluded Muslims from their councils, but worked with Assyrians and Yazidis. It was the Kurds who were particularly seen as the enemy, as hostile, and Cossacks, Russian Cossacks, and Armenian volunteers slaughtered Kurdish villages, retaliating and taking revenge for the similar slaughters that had devastated Armenian villagers. Aram himself was aware that the Russians supported Kurds, and different aims divided the Armenians and the Russians. Killing by Armenians was part of an effort to eliminate a Kurdish presence in what Armenians hoped would be a regained homeland. In June, late June, General Nikolaev, the Russian commander, ordered the Armenian administration to allow Kurds who were loyal to Russia to return to their villages and to protect them from further abuses. Aram protested, declaring that the Kurds were a threat to the Armenians, but the general stood fast. Most Kurds, however, did not take up the Russian offer and remained in their mountain retreats. Eventually, the Russians retreated. Armenians left with them reluctantly. Thousands and thousands died on the retreat to Russia. And I will conclude. The war is the central context of these events. It allowed a greater degree of arbitrariness and permissiveness in dealing with ordinary people. Once the fighting started, the state requisitioned goods, animals, drafted men into armed forces, and then deported and even killed those it considered traitors. Whatever loyalties Armenians held toward the Ottoman state became unsustainable when exile and massacre became the new norm. A state of exception had been declared vis-a-vis the Armenians. The Ottoman authorities then, as Tahsin Bey argues, drove otherwise loyal, neutral, or passive Armenians out of the imperial fold into a netherworld of resistors and outlaws. In other words, the Young Turks compounded their own Armenian problem. They made enemies of former friends, and they expanded enormous resources, which cost them terribly to render the Armenians impotent. Their own project of modernizing and securing the empire was undercut by their ambitions to make Anatolia safe from Christians. Fear and a profound sense of insecurity, compounded by the defeats in the winter of 1915 and the threats from Allied forces, combined in a toxic perception that all Armenians were an internal subversive threat allied to the Russians and had to be destroyed.